I was 15 years old, I remember reading on my phone in horror the anonymous victim statement from the Brock Turner sexual assault case at Stanford. I remember feeling this woman's pain as she described what had happened to her and the unfair court trial that had happened after. Now I'm 19 years old and I often find myself walking campus alone at night, and I worry about some of these same things happening to me. I often think about that woman who has now come forward as Chanel Miller, and think about what would happen if something like that happened to me or one of my friends. Would I get justice? Would I even want to report my case? It is in these worries and the fact that Chanel Miller's case was considered one of the lucky ones that we uncover a serious problem in our country. U.S. rape and sexual assault policies are grossly inadequate and need to be reformed. We must make these changes or we will continue in this cycle of our rape culture and continue not to bring justice to the victims that so desperately need it. Between an inconsistency in how we define sexual assault and consent in our policies, as well as too many lenient sentencings, the way courts handle sexual assault cases put targets on victims' backs and sometimes re-victimize them all over again. According to the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, or RAINN, out of every 1,000 sexual assault cases, only 5 perpetrators receive prison time. Because of these lenient sentencings and oftentimes victim blaming, so many victims don't come forward for fear of an unfair trial. In fact, RAINN also states that 3 out of 4 cases go unreported. This is a serious problem, especially when you look at these statistics compared to those of assault and battery crimes, which are much more highly reported and highly punished. According to scholars Nicole Badera and Trenton M. Halton, quote, "No 2 states have identical definitions of sexual assault," end quote. This is a serious problem because this inconsistency leaves for room for error and victim blaming to take place. In almost half the states, Stephen Schulhofer in his article, Reforming the Law of Rape, says, quote, "Sexual penetration is not a crime unless there is both non-consent and some sort of force," end quote. This means that even if there is non-consent, if there wasn't some sort of physically violent force, they oftentimes won't count it as sexual assault. This is hugely problematic because it is almost never that black and white, and sometimes that force isn't physical, but it's emotional, it's mental manipulation, it's a power disparity or a threat. So a step in the right direction would be moving to a definition consistently across states that includes all of this. Like the definition given by the Oxford Academic Journal, Social Problems, that defines sexual assault as any loss of physical autonomy through unwanted actions of a sexual nature. This definition includes not only sexual activity forced through physical violence, but also sexual activity forced through incapacitation, coercion, and other power disparities. It includes not only rape, but also other unwanted sexual touches. If we move to this definition, it can clear up a lot of errors and leave room for those who need their case to be qualified as sexual assault, but they won't. Speaking of non-consent, this is also another hugely debated definition from state to state, creating even more inconsistency. Some argue that for non-consent to happen, there has to be verbal protest, so they count silence or passivity as consent, while others will say that consent has to be that verbal, affirmative yes. This first definition is problematic, and we must move to the second definition where the verbal yes is required, because oftentimes victims aren't able to verbally protest because of many different situations, whether that be they're under threat, they're under the influence of alcohol, or like in Chanel Miller's case, they're unconscious. A victim can't possibly protest or even give verbal consent if they are unconscious, so we have to move to a definition that states that consent has to be that yes. So, obviously this is a huge problem. How do we begin to solve this? Well, first of all, we have to start with getting that consistent legislator that includes a consistent definition of sexual assault, as well as a consistent definition of consent that states that consent has to be that verbal yes. On top of this, we also have to include stricter prison sentencings and remove mandatory minimum sentencings with no early parole or probation, as well as get rid of some of that judicial legislation that leaves so much of it up to judges, which is what leads to cases like Chanel Miller's, where he gets off with way too easy time. So, sexual assault is a huge problem in this country, and to begin to solve it, it will take more than just legislative reform. It will take societal reform at our very core. But If we start creating legislation that empowers victims instead of tears them down, we can start erasing some of these issues. We may not be the people who are writing these laws, but we certainly have the power to put pressure on those that do. So go out and vote for people who will become advocates for sexual assault survivors, and become an advocate yourself. Put pressure on your government representatives to push for these consistent definitions and laws at both a local and national level. And continue to educate yourself and follow this issue. It needs your attention and it needs your advocacy. By eliminating the many failures and inconsistencies in rape policy, we can start to chip away at these issues in our society and bring much needed justice to more survivors. Thank you.